Hello all again. It's a great blessing for me to be with you here this evening. Welcome back to another episode of Reasons to Believe. So today we're going to continue our conversation and our examination of reasons for believing in the existence of God, arguments that we can make by appealing to our God-given reason. That's always important to remember, that we don't give ourselves our reason. The reason itself is a gift. But appealing to that to identify arguments that give us good reasons to believe that God does in fact exist. And not only good reasons to believe, but better reasons than believing the alternative. And that's where we left off last time after looking at 5 of the classic arguments for God's existence, is that ultimately it appears to be the case that the most rational position to hold, if we're seriously going to consider all the available evidence, is that it makes more sense to say that God, and the classical understanding of God as all-powerful and infinite and timeless and spaceless, etc., that being itself does in fact exist. What I want to do tonight is I want to touch on 2 more arguments. Now there's more arguments. There's more arguments than just the ones we're covering. But I want to touch on 2 more that have to do with the psychological understanding of why God exists, or the psychological conception of how we can use our own constitution of how we ourselves to go interior and find the existence of God, and also what's called the moral argument for God's existence. So we're adding to the depth of the arguments that we already have, but I hope that you already see this as a kind of appetizer for your own study and engaging these arguments, both the ones we've already covered in greater depth, but also seeing that there really is an enormous amount of resources available for us as Catholics. So, the first question we have to ask, of course, is, well, I mean, come on, why do we need more arguments? Haven't we spent enough time talking about arguments? Why can't we get into the spiritual stuff? Why can't we get into the questions about the divinity and nature of Christ, about the meaning of the redemption, about how God conquers sin? We're going to get there. We are going to get there. But it's important, again, to recognize where we are in terms of our cultural moment. And the data here is very, very clear. The biggest reason that most people, and especially young people, point to for leaving the church is because they believe there's no good reasons to believe in the existence of God. And so, from an evangelical perspective, meaning in terms of how we do our evangelization, the more arguments we have, the better. And that's especially thinking about the kinds of people and the kinds of situations that we encounter in all the different dimensions of our life, who, if you start off by talking about some very specific doctrinal matter within our faith, although centrally important, it might just go right over their head, or, as my mom used to say, in one ear and out the other. So these are arguments that you can have in any context whatsoever. So that's the evangelical or evangelizing reason. There's also an important spiritual reason as well, and that's to recall that Jesus calls us, that our Lord calls us to love Him with all of our mind as well, right? And so insofar as the command is to love, this is an ongoing call that we have. And so the more that we can get to know God with our minds, the more that we can get to know the object of our love and enter deeper and deeper into that relationship. So while this may sound heady at times, we're going to be entering into kinds of arguments where your brain may feel that's twisting into a pretzel again, and that can seem remote from spiritual concerns and from a life of piety. Let's do the best that we can to relocate it back into the center and see that this is what we are commanded to do, that we've been given the gift of our intellect, the gift of our rationality, as one of the fundamental, not the only one, but one of the fundamental means of getting closer and closer to our Lord. Now, I've chosen the psychological and the moral arguments in particular because, as I noted, we're at a time and place, especially in our culture, and this is generally across the West in general, in which we're having 2 major difficulties in addition to the difficulty of just people don't think that there's good reasons to believe in God. One of them is the conception of what it means to be an individual or a self is also in greatly under attack right now. That it's not clear to many people what it means to be a me, what it means to be an I. How do we define ourselves as an I? Now, the generic answer that we typically get from the secular culture is, well, you get to be whatever it is you choose to be. But then the question that we all have, at least in private, is, what should I choose to be, right? And then the secular answer is, whatever you choose to be. And then usually that means something in terms of, buying lots of stuff and being associated with these kinds of brands. So this argument actually has great cultural relevance. It's an old one, but for our audience today, it's an important one. The second one with regards to morality is also central. I can't tell you again how many times I hear from students and from people I just engage in conversation with that for them it's obvious. Now, it's not something they've really engaged deeply, but the conclusion is obvious that there's no such thing as morality. Now, they don't live that way. They don't act that way. And they don't actually believe that in terms of their own orientation to their life, but they do say it. And so looking at the question of morality, how we think about morality, and how it's justified, and how ultimately it really only makes sense if we postulate that God exists, is also an important question for our days. So again, 2 more arguments. This doesn't exhaust everything, but hopefully this adds some depth to the foundation that we've already established. So let me start off with what's called the psychological argument, or the argument from the unity of the self. And again, I'm going to ask your patience here because we have to move through these steps with some care. But ultimately, what I hope will become apparent is that these ideas, which again may seem remote, are actually, they're already deeply inscribed in you. And that's something that I want to bring out all the time when we're doing theology. We're doing something that's native to us. And the metaphor that I like to use, among others, is breathing. So we all know how to breathe pretty well, right? But actually, if we learn techniques for breathing, we can do something that's native to us even better, and we can get to the point where it becomes an important part of who we are. Well, that's what we're doing when we do theology. We're doing something that we do naturally. It's not like learning to juggle, where I don't know how to learn to juggle, and it looks really hard to do. So, some people know how to do it. I don't. That's that. Not with theology. We all do know how to do it. It's a question of learning how to take what we already have underneath the surface and to bring it up, and in that sense, become better masters at it, all under the rubric of loving God with our minds, in addition to our heart and our soul. So, this is going to sound a bit familiar, but I'm going to give it a twist here. So, basically, laid out in these specific steps. The first thing we have to realize is the mind has access to truth that our mind can know, but we can't explain. So it's something that I can tell you that I understand it, but I can't explain why I understand it. And as many times I've used these examples, so for example, I know that 0 cannot be a 1, or I know that a whole is greater than a part, or I know that something can't come from nothing. I know that. I know it to be true, but if you ask me to explain it, I'm just going to repeat it to you, right? Something can't come from nothing. Well, why? Because something can't come from nothing. Well, why? Because there's a nothing and there's a something and something can't come. Well, why? So again, it's this, we hit this sort of rock bottom in terms of our apprehension, but we still know it. Okay, so let's assume that's true, that our mind has access to things that it knows is true, but it can't get beneath them. Now, insofar as our mind cannot explain the origin of these truths, meaning I can't tell you why I think that's true without just repeating it, and yet I still have knowledge of it, that points to this sort of sub-conclusion or early conclusion, that whatever it's pointing to must be true because my mind doesn't permit me to think otherwise, and it also somehow has to be outside of my mind, meaning that what my mind is doing is it's not generating something and then saying, that's what I know. It's apprehending something. Our mind is like a hook, and it's grabbing onto something outside of ourselves. So we identify the truth as something that is actually real, it's true, and it's outside of us. Therefore, if that's true, then there must be some truth outside of us that exists independently of our mind. I know this is getting like, what? Okay. To say that the truth is true is to say it's true whether or not a mind knows it or not, right? The actual existence of the truth doesn't depend upon me seeing it and pointing it out. In fact, that's sort of incidental to the truth, that there's a knower. It is what it is. So let me give you an example here, the problem of what I want to call the ignorant artist. So if you go to an art show, and let's say it's a show of a sculptor, and you ask the sculptor to explain to you everything that he or she has created. And let's say the sculptor can explain just about everything, but can't explain to you what the materials are made out of or exactly the method that he or she used to put it together. So it can give you a partial explanation, but not a full explanation. Well, the question would be, why can't you tell me everything about this piece that you made? Right? You made it. You created it. So tell me everything. Tell me absolutely every step along the way, including where it ultimately came from. And the artist says to you, I don't know. I literally can't say it. It's ineffable. Well, you see, that's what it's like for me to say that I create a truth. If I'm saying that the truth isn't out here, it's somehow in here and I create it, it's my own creation, not that it's been given to me, but I, like an artist, fashion my own truth, then I should be able to explain to you why I know the truth as true, right? But we already established early on in the argument that I can't do that. I actually can't get behind the truth to explain why the truth is true. I just say, I don't know. It just is. Well, that's because we are not artists in the sense of creating truths. We are artists in the sense of working with that which has already been given to us. So because of that recognition that the truth, again, is external to us and we're sort of participating in it, we're making it, we're appropriating it, taking it as a part of ourselves, we recognize that, again, it's grounded outside of us. And then we see that it can't be that there's just all these other truths out there, that ultimately there must be one truth. And as Thomas Aquinas says it, you can't have so many truths out there that a truth contradicts a truth. In order for it to be true, it can't be contradicted by other truths. And then ultimately you see, well, I guess the condition for the possibility, the only way that's possible is if there's one truth that's independent, non-contingent, means exists by itself. Well, what could we call that truth? Well, we could call it God. So the idea is that just by doing an analysis of how we know what we know, and what our mind is capable of knowing, and what our mind is capable of not knowing, we can sort of through the back door get into a recognition that we must be participating in something eternal and real and true. And we can call that God. Now I know that's a bit egg-headed sounded, so I'll try and give a more intuitive approach to this. So this is drawing on some of the same insights, but doing it in a way where you can play along at home, as it were. All right.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
Can you yourself give unity to yourself? Can you yourself create yourself, especially create yourself sort of ex nihilo, meaning I make myself into existence? Now, I don't just mean the self understood as an individual in a biological sense made up of matter, made up of stuff. we established, and this is of course just commonsensical, we established in an early lecture that I don't make up the stuff of which I am made. That depends upon a cause, it depends upon a cause, that depends upon a cause, etc. We already got through that. I mean your own individual personality. I mean what defines you and not as somebody else. Are you free to create that ex nihilo or out of nothing? So here's where we can start experimenting with ourselves. You don't even need to stand up to do this. And here I'm drawing on some insights from St. Augustine. So here I am, I'm talking with you all, and I'm standing here in front of this podium, and you're sitting, and at least pretending to listen to me, which I appreciate very much. So as you're doing that, you can recognize that you are the person who's sitting right there right now, right? Now, as you're that person sitting there right now, you can also enter into yourself and rise above yourself and look down on yourself, as it were, and say, well, here I am. There I am. I'm sitting there. Well, why am I seated this way? Why am I fidgeting in this particular kind of way? Or, why am I hungry? Or why am I tired? In other words, you turn yourself right now into a me. You become a me to yourself, and there's an I above you that's looking down at you and saying, well, aren't I interesting, right? Well, it doesn't just stop there, right? You can also, that same I can go above the I and turn the lower I and then the you sitting there all into one me and say, well, we have an interesting specimen here. We have somebody who's me looking at somebody else who's also me, and you can start asking questions about the observer of the person being observed. Well, you see, it's still you, but now you are 2 levels above yourself. Well, here's the point. You can keep doing that, right? We all have the capacity to keep doing that, to go above and above and above, and to look, as it were, on the totality of who we are in sort of this vertical chain of existence, and looking down and saying, well, what am I, and how am I, and why this, and why that? And enter into even an internal conversation of all these different selves talking to each other. And you can imagine like the chatter multiplying. And it's all you. It's all me. It's all an I, and it's all a me at the same time. Well, the insight is that, well, let me just do that for a while. Let me keep asking and going and going and going, and soon I'll recognize I can't do that forever. I can't have an infinite regression of an I creating a me. And here's the other insight. I ultimately can never totally get outside of myself. Because anytime that I try and totally get outside of myself, I'm still myself. Meaning I can never purely make myself into an object. I'm always a subject, an I, and an object, a me at the same time. And so in that sense, even if I can expand myself vertically in this self-examination, I'm still contained. I'm still in a capsule of myself, as it were. So then when you get to that upper limit, that upper horizon of where you're seeking to understand yourself, there's this recognition, this insight that I'm not alone. It's not just me here. In fact, the only way that I'm even capable of doing this is that I'm existing within a space that has sort of been created for me. Not a space that I have created, but something that sort of pre-exists within which I am living. And the light that I am using to examine myself from top to bottom, well, I didn't generate that. That light has been given to me by something outside of me. In other words, I must be in relationship to something that is deeply inside of me and also outside of me and makes me possible every microsecond of my existence. In other words, there must be some kind of ultimate being that makes me as a particular being possible all the time. All the time. And the only thing that's necessary in order to have contact with that being is to go in and up. So this is where St. Augustine says, for example, that you know me, speaking about God, you know me better than I know myself. So that's the vertical understanding. And just play around with that and see what happens as you get higher and higher and higher inside yourself if you don't start bumping up against the cusp of the limits of the self and then realize that there's something holding you in existence. So that's the vertical model. There's also the horizontal model, and this one's fun. So we all assume that I am, for example, the same person I am right now that I was when I woke up. And that person who's also the same person that I am now when I woke up is also the same person from a year ago or 10 years ago. Or perhaps you've had the experience of looking at pictures of yourself when you're in high school, when you're a child, and thinking, that's me. I'm the same person. Somehow, that's me. I'm not looking at a different person. I'm looking at myself. Well, things get really strange if you let your mind wander a little bit and start asking, but how is that me? But no, really, like, how am I the same person? In fact, I don't even need to do this long span of time from when, my body was this big to when my body was, this big, and say, how is that possible for me to be the same person? I can just look from moment to moment to moment to moment to moment and ask myself, how is it possible that there's a unity that's holding me together? In fact, this is all being filmed, so this is a helpful metaphor. Think of the old school film before it was digital, right? If you slowed down film and slowed it down more and slowed it down more and slowed it down more, what you would see is that a moving image, it's not actually a moving image, right? That's an illusion. What it is it's a series of snapshots, snap, 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 that when you move it along fast enough, it looks like the person is moving. Well, we can do that with our own lives and just imagine ourselves in extra slow motion in everything that we're doing, and then zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. And imagine it's like a cartooner. I think of the first cartoon, think of Walt Disney drawing the first drawings of Mickey Mouse, and it's a snapshot, it's a picture. Well, that's actually the case from a physical perspective. As purely physical beings, if you zoom in on any one of us, all you're ever going to get in space and time is a snapshot. So then the question is, well, what thread runs through all of us in our own individual lives that binds me into a particular kind of person? Can we do it just with stuff? Can I give you just a purely chemical explanation, a purely physical explanation in terms of how I am a unified being through time and space? We have some additional problems to consider there of how we get this unity of the self. One of them is the problem of change. So we can use a positive example first. Maybe you've done something over the years and now you're better at it. Maybe you had a bad habit. And now that bad habit is one that you've conquered. Maybe it was a problem with drinking too much, or maybe it was a problem with eating too much, or maybe it was a problem with being irritable and being mean-spirited. But now you're not that way. You've changed. You've gotten better. Well, in what sense can we say then that it's still you? Well, really, are you a different person now than you were before? Now, we say that conversationally. I'm different. I'm a different man than I used to be. But I don't literally mean that I've changed identities, that I'm somehow occupying a different form of being in the world. I'm saying that I've improved, I've changed. Well, that therefore means, if that's true, that I can be the same person but better, that must mean that I must be occupying or existing within some kind of entity or unity that is capable both of change and of maintaining itself the same in some fundamental way. And the point is we can't do that materially. If we're just talking about the brain, if we're just talking about chemicals, if we're just talking about electricity in our neurons, we can't speak that way. Because again, that itself doesn't provide either the unity or the explanation for how somebody can grow. We also have the opposite example of how can somebody become less than what they used to be? How does somebody become bad? How does somebody lose virtue? How does somebody enter into a form of life where they become more themselves? Well, first of all, in order even to say that somebody has gone down a bad path, we must have some kind of fixed standard of the potential of what that person is. Otherwise, we don't know that they've deviated from it and gone down a bad path. Again, that's not something that we can do if we just are talking about matter. We need something that is stable through space and time with regards to who they are and their identity. Also, how can we recognize that there's a lessness there? How can there both be the same person and a lessness unless we also recognize that fixedness? I know this sounds abstract, but here's a really concrete example of it. Because people can say, well, you know what it is? It's just the brain. The brain is a marvelous organ. And it is a marvelous organ. And it's capable of things that we still don't and maybe we'll never completely understand. And one materialist answer could be, well, the brain holds itself in time and space and is constantly generating the self, projecting the self into the future, and pulling itself from the past into the present to create a person. And that's just a fixture of the brain. It's just a brain capacity that we have. And evidence of that, they'll say, is we'll think about when somebody, for example, starts suffering from Alzheimer's or senility or they have a brain injury. Well, you see there, the personality's gone, right? And so that's evidence, they say, for their position, that it's not that there's this thing called the soul, which is what I've been trying to move us towards this whole time. It's that we have an illusion of the soul, but it's actually just a very complex chemical process that we don't quite understand. In many instances, well documented scientifically, in the hours or moments before death, people who have otherwise have been incapable of opening their eyes, in some cases for very long periods of time, will suddenly come back. And they'll be exactly the person that they were before the disease or the accident or something or whatever exactly happened to them. And what they're typically doing in these instances is they're saying goodbye and oftentimes talking to people who otherwise people can't be seen by the others in the room. They're not hallucinating. That's the point of calling it lucidity. They're actually present in the moment, seeing everything that's going on as they slip out of biological existence into what we would say eternal existence. So what all this evidence points to is that we have something called a soul. That there is something about being human that involves a unity, an immaterial unity that binds us together as a person that interacts very, very closely with the body. And in fact, that's what we believe as Catholics, is that the way that you use your body, including using your body to do either good things or bad things, actually sort of seeps into your soul, for better or for worse. So the body and the soul, it's not that we have the soul sort of just floating around inside of us. It's that we are united